everyone, and welcome to an evening with Eowyn Ivey, brought to you by Whatcom Reads, Whatcom County's largest book group. So we're really glad you're here. It seems appropriate that this year we would read a book for Whatcom Reads that's set in an earlier time with a strong female lead who lives life on her own terms. Eowyn Ivey's novel, To the Bright Edge of the World, introduces us to Sophie Forrester, the young bride of Lieutenant Colonel Alan Forrester. While Alan commands an expedition up the Wolverine River in Alaska, Sophie explores the new art of photography back at the Vancouver Barracks in Washington Territory. Spoiler alert, I loved this book. I loved this novel. The historic details, the adventure story in the Alaskan wilderness, the interweaving of the Native American mythology, the love story of Sophie and Alan. I mean, what's not to love? It was so good. The Whatcom Reads team loved that this book had so many rich themes to explore through various events that we held leading up to Eowyn's visit, and we hope that many of you had a chance to attend those. I'm so pleased to welcome Eowyn back to Bellingham. You may have heard that she's a 1995 Western Washington University graduate, and I'm guessing we might have some other Western alumni in the audience tonight, a few here and there. So since her days as a Viking, Eowyn has worked as a reporter, as a bookseller, and as a writer in Alaska, where she was raised, and where she currently lives with her husband and 2 children. Her work has appeared in magazines and literary journals. Her first novel, The Snow Child, which is also phenomenal if you haven't read it, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and an international bestseller. To the Bright Edge of the World is her second novel. If you haven't read the book yet, I have zero doubt that before she is done here tonight, you will want to read it, and you'll be telling everyone else to read it. Please join me in welcoming Eowyn Ivey to the Whatcom Reads short speech.
Thank you. Thank you all so much, and thank you, Rachel, for the wonderful introduction. It's so wonderful to see. I can kind of see you guys out there. I'm going to have to shield my eyes so I can see you. And if you don't mind, I'm going to take your photo really quick. Do you guys mind? If you don't want your photo taken, hide your face really quick. Hopefully this will come out. It's just wonderful to see you all out here. This is a fantastic turnout. Yay, thank you all for coming. Thank you. And I want to give a huge thank you to all the Whatcom libraries and Village Books and the people here at the theater for making me welcome and bringing me here. And really to the whole community. I mean, to have this kind of turnout and involvement with a literary event is just incredible. I was just over at Allied Arts and getting to see the paintings and mass media, multimedia sculpture kind of things and woodworking that were all done having to do with the bright edge of the world. And it's just an incredible honor as a writer to have a whole community come around a book like this. But also it's inspiring to me as a reader. You guys are really fortunate to have this kind of whole community involvement and Whatcom Libraries making this happen. So I just want to give a shout to all of them for making it happen and for you for participating, because this is what makes it all work. So thank you to you all. And I also want to say, thank you for the weather. And you're going to think that I'm being sarcastic, but I'm not. When I left my house on Wednesday morning, we woke up and had just snowed another foot, and it was 2 below zero on the thermometer. And so when I get here, it's like it's springtime here. I love it. I'm wearing my rain jacket out walking around, and it just feels delightful. So thank you for that. I'm not rushing back to do all that shoveling, I got to tell you. We've had a heck of a winter up there. So I think what I want to do is tell you a little bit about how the Bright Edge of the World came to be, like how my path went in terms of writing it and some of the inspiration behind it. And I'm going to read a couple shorter passages and just sort of talk about the process. But then what I would really like to do is turn it into more of a Q&A. So I'm going to put the pressure back on you a little bit. So try to be thinking of some questions, partly because I get a little self-conscious just standing up here talking on. And if I feel like I'm beginning to have a conversation with you all, it's a lot more fun for me. So maybe you can be thinking of questions in the back of your mind as we're going. So as it was mentioned, Rachel mentioned, I graduated from Western in 1995, so I realized that I'm coming up on my 25th anniversary of graduating from Western, which seems completely unbelievable to me. But when I came to Western, I thought I wanted to be a creative writing major at first, but then I ended up switching to journalism. I needed a practical career, like how am I going to earn a living as a writer? And my husband and I ended up going back up to Alaska, and I was an intern at a little newspaper called The Frontiersman, and I worked worked there for about 10 years. But I realized I really wanted to write a novel. Like that was where I've always loved reading fiction. I was never a big reader of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, and I wanted to write a novel. So I ended up working at Fireside Books in Palmer, Alaska. If anybody ever gets to go through Palmer, it's not nearly as big and wonderful as Village Books, but it is a really lovely little bookstore, and it has new and used books. And I ended up working there for about 10 years, and I started working first on The Snow Child. That was where I found the inspiration for The Snow Child, actually, because I came across a little children's paperback book called The Snow Child, and it was the Snegurochka fairy tale. So it was really working as a bookseller that I found the inspiration for that novel and for this novel. So what happened is I think I was actively writing The Snow Child, and I was still working at the bookstore part-time, and I was shelving books, and a kind of rare used copy of A Report of an Expedition by Henry T. Allen came into the store. And that's one thing I love about bookstores that have used books, because you never know what you're going to find in those boxes that people bring in. And it was this, an expedition that I had never heard of. So both my husband and I grew up in Alaska. We love adventure stories. I was just shocked that I had never heard of this expedition. So it was sort of, a somewhat more dry military report describing this journey. Henry T. Allen, a young lieutenant, leading these two other men up the Copper River. Those of you who have ever eaten Copper River sockeye salmon, you know the Copper River. And so, as I'm reading this, I was able to borrow it from the bookstore. It was a very expensive copy of it. And David Cheesem, the owner, was always kind enough to allow me to borrow books, used books, and bring them home, and then I could bring them back, So I brought it home, and I kept reading parts out loud to my husband. I said, can you believe what the adventure these men went on? And we were just both blown away by it. But I was, it never even crossed my mind that this was going to be something I was going to write about. I was really excited and involved with The Snow Child at that point. So I brought the report back and put it on the shelf, and it eventually sold. And I didn't think about it for a long time. Well, what happened with The Snow Child is I was able to meet an agent who wanted to represent it. And at that point, I thought, wow, my book's practically sold, right? You have an agent, that's it. It's going out into the world. No, not so. So he and I worked on revising it and editing it, and then he started to send it out a little bit to editors here and there that he knew that he thought might be interested. And we started getting the no's, we like the writing, but we just don't know about the story, whatever. We started getting these rejections from editors. And my agent had a great idea. He said, you know what, just don't focus on that. Start working on your next book. So it was long before The Snow Child, it was even published, that I started writing To the Bright Edge of the World. And what happened is I started thinking about what I wanted to write about next. And at that point, I was reading a lot of just Alaskan stories, legends, mythology, a lot of stories both from indigenous, native people and white people that had moved there more recently. And I was fascinated by these stories of monsters in lakes. There's Lake Iliamna, which is a very famous lake in Alaska. There are stories that people say they've seen huge Loch Ness kind of monsters swimming in that lake. And I just thought, wow, this is fascinating. But then I remembered back to that expedition, that report, and I was able to find a copy. Someone had reprinted it, actually, reissued it in a new form. I was able to get a copy of it. And I started thinking about this idea, trying to combine these stories, these legends that I had come across with the expedition, with the idea that, what if when explorers went into new territory, what if they weren't just discovering sort of the flora and the fauna and the geology and meeting the people, but what if they were walking directly into the stories of those people, so experiencing those stories firsthand? So that was kind of how the book started to come about for me. And I'll give you a really concrete example of when it started to sort of gel for me, when I thought this was the story I wanted to tell. I had been reading the expedition report, and there was a discussion in there. One of the main things that the men faced was starvation. I mean, that was really the biggest danger to them throughout their journey. And even though there were lots of other things that were frightening and maybe more adventurous, it was the starvation that was the real issue. And at one point they talked about, and I think it was actually in the journals, so I was able to read the journals of one of the young men on the expedition. They were at a museum in Anchorage, and I was able to check them out and read them. And he talked about them just desperately wanting the Canada geese to fly over, to start coming into the territory on their migration, so that they could get geese meat and also maybe some eggs. So they were just so hungry. It occupied their entire minds. But at the same time, I had a copy of a book by Richard Nelson. Some of you might know Richard Nelson. He lived in Southeast Alaska. He actually just just passed away not that long ago. He's a wonderful naturalist. I mean, he's just so many things that he was doing. An anthropologist, a naturalist. He had a radio show on public radio up in Alaska. But he had a book that was sort of a collection of stories that he had gotten from Alaska Native elders. But what I came across was just a chapter note. It was like a quotation at the beginning of a chapter. And the rest of the chapter really didn't have much to do with this one little thing. But what it says, it was a quote from an elder that said, "When the world was new and mostly water, women were geese." And it struck me. All of a sudden I thought, because I had just read that passage in the journals about them hunting geese, that I started to think, oh, this is something really interesting here. And so that was how I started to kind of imagine that this book would be formed. And so I'm going to read first a section from Alan Forster. See, I almost called him Henry Allen. We can talk about that too, about why I fictionalized all the characters. So Alan Forster is a lieutenant colonel, and he is a veteran of the Indian Wars and the Civil War, and he is leading this expedition. And it's told all through diaries and journals and documents, which I'll talk a little bit later about why I went about it that way. But I'm going to read a section about the geese women. I think it kind of underscores what I'm talking about these two different dynamics coming together in one place. Let me see if I can find. Usually, oftentimes my husband comes with me when I'm doing things like this, and he has all my page numbers memorized. So if I can't find a page, every once in a while he'll shout out for me, "It's page 85. Now she's not with me, so I have my little piece of paper so that I know which page I'm supposed to go to. Okay, so again, this is from Alan Forster's Diaries, and it's April 28th, 1885. Before dawn, Tillman, he's one of the men on the journey, and Pruitt, the lieutenant, the three of us set out for the marshland to hunt the Canada geese we have seen fly overhead. Boyd and Samuelson, who are the two trappers and translators that are going along with them, they were to travel up to a nearby valley. They continue to look for precious metals in these mountains. Our hope was to reach the marsh as the sun was rising so as to find the geese before they took wing. The morning was clear and cold. We walked up the river valley for a mile or so. As we neared the marsh, through the willows, we heard a cacophony. Geese, the sergeant mouthed silently. I was not sure. At first, it sounded much like waterfowl, restless honks and the occasional flap of wing and splash. Then my ear would catch something else, a laugh or a word. We crept through the brush, emerged at the edge of the wetland. We faced directly into first light as it broke through the mountains. Frost and brittle ice had formed during the cold night, but a small stream ran open among the hummocks of dead grass. Although not much wider than a stride, the stream was clear and shoulder deep. Not far off, near a stand of large cottonwood trees, at least 24 women gathered. Some sat on the grass, others waded and swam. Their hair shone long and black in the sun. They wore hide tunics similar to those favored by Alaskan Indians, but these skins were of a paler shade, a near white, and without adornments. Tillman, the sergeant, stumbled out of the brush at this inopportune moment, grabbed at the willows as he tripped. The lieutenant put a finger to his lips, but it was too late. The commotion had startled the women. Several looked in our direction and shrieked at the sight of us. Soon they were all shouting and fleeing. As they scattered, they splashed through the water, and it caught the glare of the rising sun. It was a blinding scene. In that same instant, countless wild geese took flight from the very midst of the women, so that wing and black hair, scream and strangled honk were indistinguishable. None of us would shoot in the direction of the women, so we were stalled. Then, from perilously near, we heard the sound of arrows in flight. We crouched, raised our rifles, but their aim was not us. The Minuski Indians had come with the same intention, to hunt geese. Arrows struck several of the birds before they could gain altitude. The geese fell, flopped in the marsh. The Indians continued to send their arrows. They'll hit the women, the sergeant said. Indeed, it was true. Pruitt pointed toward the cottonwoods where one of the women flailed against a tree. The Indians lowered their bows. The geese that had not been killed were now airborne and out of reach. The women had all vanished, all but the one who had been struck. The woman became still at our approach, watched us through strange eyes, so gleaming and black that they appeared to have no center. Her skin was neither white like ours nor brown like the Indians, but instead a translucent gray. Her lips were dull black, as if coated with charcoal, and broad bands of white, like paint, ran down either of her cheeks. Her skin, her hair, her pale tunic, all were speckled with beads of water. At first, I thought the arrow pierced her, but as we neared, I saw that it passed harmlessly through the skin shift at her side and pinned her to the tree. I reached to pull the arrow, but the woman seized my wrist. Her grasp was wet and leathery. I then saw that a slick membrane webbed her fingers. Her nails were black, slender and sharp. She turned her head slightly to look at me through one of her peculiar eyes. She blinked so quickly that surely I am mistaken, but it seemed as if her eyelids flickered from bottom to top in an uncanny way. She lowered her head and hissed at me, a frightful sound. Overhead, the flock of geese circled and cried. So I'm going to stop there with that reading. You have to do that. Thank you. I just have to say, too, there were so many amazing pieces of art at the Allied Arts, but one of them was a woman had done an acrylic painting of this scene. So there are geese flying off, and there are tunics laying out on, so this transformation is shown on the page. And it was just amazing to see that image translated into another art form, and one that I have absolutely no skill in, so it was really, really amazing to see. So, kind of a pause for the artist here. It's really wonderful. I think because of the way I was doing the research, I did a tremendous amount of research for this book, especially compared to The Snow Child. The Snow Child really, I looked at some of the Russian fairy tale background, but it was largely informed by my life in Alaska in terms of the concrete details of how Jack and Mabel lived. But this book was an entirely different world. I was doing so much research, both physically in terms of, I did a float trip of the Copper River with my husband just to kind of see that landscape more specifically. I did a trip, even though I had been to Vancouver, Washington, my mom and I did a trip to Fort Vancouver so I could visit the fort, see where Sophie would have lived. So there was a lot of that kind of research because I didn't want to get any of the details wrong. But even more, there was a lot of research of me just digging around online, reading journals, reading diaries from women whose men had gone off to the polar expeditions, or reading letters between husbands and wives as these kind of adventures were happening. And I started also digging around, looking for things on like eBay and Etsy in terms of photographs and images from that time period. So I think that process of doing the research is what sort of sparked my idea of wanting to tell the story that way through journals and documents. Like I wanted the feeling that you had just, as a reader, you had just uncovered this crate in an attic and you're sort of reaching in and pulling things out and not knowing what you're going to find next. I wanted a little bit of surprise in what you're going to see when you turn the page. And I have to admit, I was feeling a little clever at this, right? Like I'd come up with this really, like I was doing something new. Like The Snow Child was told in a fairly traditional novel style, but I felt like I'm doing something cutting edge. So then I happened to go back and read Bram Stoker's Dracula, I think it was published 1867, and it's written the same way, all journals and documents. And I thought, but then actually it was helpful because I was able to see how he had managed suspense. It's tricky, if someone's writing a diary, clearly they haven't been killed off yet, right? So you have to figure out ways to manage suspense. So I looked to that and I tried to be inspired of it and not feel like I wasn't just retracing old ground that had been done before. But you'll see if you have a copy of the book, a lot of these different images are in here now. And for example, the map at the beginning, I want to tell you a little bit about this because this also has a Bellingham, Western Washington University connection. Along with the journals and documents and images, I wanted to have a map because, as a kid, some of my very favorite books, like, The Hobbit and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, a lot of these books you would open, and on the inside cover there would be a map. And I would always get this, excited feeling, right? We're going on an adventure. And I wanted to do that. And so I reached out to Ruth Holbert. By some chance, some of you might know her. She graduated from Western. She did a dual degree in biology and art. She's just a fantastic artist, and she works at Fireside Books. I think you'll find this probably at Village Books, too. A lot of interesting artistic people work in independent bookstores. And so she and I were working together at the time, and I said, hey, is there any chance that you might be willing, I'll pay you, commission it, to do a map for my new book? And she was very excited about it, and she completely exceeded my expectations because what she did is she read my book and got all the details because those those of you who have read it have realized probably now that it is not set on the Copper River. I used that original expedition as an inspiration, but I wanted to entirely fictionalize the place and the people so that I could tell my own story. So it's on the Wolverine River, which is the same river that I invented for the Snow Child. So I had thrown her this kind of weird task of drawing a map of a place that kind of existed, but kind of didn't. And she read my book so closely and mimicked the military-style maps of the time. And I just think she did an amazing job. I'm so impressed with it. And I also always tell the story that she put a raven as the compass. And she said, the idea is that, the trickster raven, do not use this map to plan your Alaska vacation. Because it's not accurate. But, Ruth also did the sketches. So Pruitt, those of you who have read it, it might have taken you a little while to figure out who the journals were from that had some drawings and maybe some odd kind of prose poetry. And that was Lieutenant Pruitt. And Ruth Hulbert did the sketches for me for those as well. And again, I just thought she had the perfect touch. She's an amazing artist. And I'll say, too, that, when I envisioned this, I sold it on contract to my publisher. So Little Brown had published The Snow Child, and then we were working on the second book, and I had maybe 25, 50 pages, I think, into it, and an outline. And I had this idea of wanting to have the postcards and the photographs. And my editor at the time was just not keen on it. She said, we've tried to do this before with novels. It's it's not worth the hassle. It's a lot of money and time on our part, and it doesn't really seem to do much for readers on the reader's end. Well, my agent, his philosophy is, if it's just more work for you, just do the work, right? He's always wanting me to just do more work, which is good. He keeps at me that way. And he said, look, just get everything together. Commission the map, pay the artist to do the drawings, secure the rights to use all the images you want, scan them, have them done professionally, everything done professionally. And then when you turn the manuscript in, just give that all to them. Like, how can they say no if it's all just sitting there and they don't have to do anything? And so I thought, okay, maybe this will work. So that's what I did. When I sent in the manuscript, I sent all the images and everything with them. And I did not know until I got my galley that they were all going to be in there. And not only were they going to be in there, but the publisher, I think, did a phenomenal job with the printing. You look at them, and they're just very well done in terms of the print quality, and some of them are even in full color, even in the paperback. So I was so grateful, both to my agent for making me do all that hard work, and to my editor and publisher for making that happen. So one of the questions I often get with the photographs, like, what are they really, and where did they come from? And so some of them, I'm not sure I'll be able to find it right now. There's a postcard of a polar bear, and it says something like Merry Christmas on the back. Well, that's actually a postcard from 1885 that I bought on eBay and had a friend scan it in for me. So that's an accurate 1885 thing. Some of the other ones are photographs that I took, and then my friend digitally enhanced them to make them look like old photographs. And that's the case with this one. I don't know if you'll be able to even see it out there, but it's of a glacier, and that's a photograph I took of a glacier near our house, and then he digitally enhanced it to make it look like it was one of the old original photographs. But probably the one that I get the most questions about is the photograph of Sophie. So people want to know, who is that photograph really? Is there really a Sophie? Someone said, well, I looked up Henry Allen, the original lieutenant that actually did the expedition, and I looked at pictures of his wife, and it doesn't look anything like her. Well, this is kind of a funny story. So Sophie's photograph is one that I bought on eBay. It was a cabinet photograph. So they just sell these, sometimes you can buy them for a few dollars. Sometimes they're more expensive. So it's an actual portrait from 1880s that someone had. You can sometimes see them at antique stores or flea markets. They'll have these cabinet photographs. And so I bought, maybe a half dozen photographs of women from that time. And I pinned them up on my bulletin board. And as I was writing, I kept looking at them and thinking, is that Sophie? Is that one Sophie? So finally, I picked the photograph that's included in the book that you can find in there. And I do have to say, and I think I said this to the Ferndale Library group that we met with earlier today, is that I keep waiting for someone at one of these things to come up and say, hey, that's my Aunt Emma. So far, it hasn't happened. If anyone knows who that photograph really is, I'd love to know. But in my world, it's Sophie. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how Sophie came to be and just address some of the questions that I get about her. In the case of Alan Forrester, He's not Henry Allen in any sense of the word. The real Henry Allen was a very young man. He didn't have any of that veteran background experience that my character did. I think he was engaged maybe when he went on his journey, but he was not married. He was just but the thing is I didn't want to try to tell the whole story of who Henry Allen was. I just wanted to borrow from his expedition and then make up my own story. And it's interesting because I was really grateful that I made that decision, because once the book was going to come out, I got a Facebook message from a man who said he lives in Washington, D.C., and he's a descendant of Henry Allen. And he was really excited about the book, but it made me grateful that I hadn't tried to tell the story of his family. Like, I didn't do all that research. I invented my own character. And the same is true with Sophie. So she wasn't really inspired by any specific person. There were some different things that came into play as I was developing her character. One of them, I think one of the initial most important factors, if any of you have read The Snow Child, or if you haven't read it, Mabel, the main character, suffers a tremendous loss. And she deals with it, but I think she's a somewhat depressive personality. I mean, I think she struggles with depression, and at times she was a heavy character to bear. And when I got to Sophie, I wanted to just have a very different female character, one that maybe dealt with some of the same difficult challenges in her life, but dealt with them entirely differently. So that was part of my motivation, was to explore how a woman could maybe tackle things in a different way, and specifically through art. And somebody asked me a great question actually today at Ferndale about, why photography? So Sophie ends up being interested in photography. And I think part of it was the idea that in 1885, photography was a fairly cutting edge art. It was just recently becoming available to amateurs, and being something that people, the everyday person, could afford to get a camera and learn how to develop photos. So I think that was exciting to me. I wanted Sophie to be the kind of character who went after these sort of edgier things, who had a lot of drive and motivation in her life, even as she was dealing with tremendous loss. So that was part of my motivation for her character. Another motivation was I've always been fascinated by women naturalists. Like I feel like I don't have the patience to sit and watch birds forever, but I love reading about women doing it. Beatrix Potter, I read the biography of Beatrix Potter, and I had no idea that she was hugely fascinated by fungus and had documented all these different kinds of mushrooms and done these beautiful drawings. And I remember thinking, I don't have the patience to learn about fungus, but I love reading that she did this. This is incredible, right? So, and as I was starting to figure out who Sophie was, I discovered a woman named Cordelia Stanwood, and she was in Maine around the turn of the century and was a photographer. She was very different than Sophie. She was, by the time she came to photography, she was a little older. She'd never been married. From what I've read, it sounds like she was a bit of a curmudgeon. But her photography was incredible. Some of you might have seen, there's a very famous photograph that she took that's 3 little chickadee chicks lined up on a branch, and it's a black and white photograph, and it's just amazing. So she was a photographer around this time who was doing photographs that were so respected that they were being picked up by different ornithological magazines. She became very well respected in the field despite being a woman, which I found just fascinating of the times. So that was part of my inspiration with Sophie, following these different leads and just my own curiosity and my own passions and the things that I admire. Those were all part of the things I was interested in. And another question that I often get is why dive back into pregnancy loss? I mean, I hate to give away too much if some of you haven't read it, but that was a question I think I got asked at Ferndale as well today, and I thought it was a terrific question. Why have her suffer that same loss that Mabel did of losing a pregnancy? And I think that, again, looking at my character with Mabel, I wanted to show, I got some comments from young women with the Snow Child saying, I think you're telling me that the only way a woman can be happy is if she has a baby. And I was like, no, that's not at all what I wanted to say. And I think it motivated me a little bit with Sophie. I wanted to show that she ended up having a tremendous life and so much success and adventure, maybe partly because she didn't have children. And so it was fun for me as a writer to explore the same challenges facing a different character, a different personality type. So I think those things all came into play as I was writing Sophie. So I want to read a section from Sophie real quick, just so you kind of get, those of you who haven't read it yet, or you can get a little taste of her character. I have to say, too, I feel like one of my biggest, well, I have lots of weaknesses as a writer, I think, but one of them is that I'm not good at comedy. I'm not a funny writer. And as a kid, I remember, when you have to read out your little stories in school, and some of the kids were so good at getting a good laugh from everybody, and I never did that. There would just be kind of silence after I read whatever I'd written. So I'm going to read to you what I think is my only funny scene in a book that I've ever written. And I think it's my best attempt at humor. So whatever that tells you when you hear it, that means you have to laugh, right? Otherwise, you'll be like, oh, that was supposed to be a funny scene? I didn't know. I got to find my page mark here again. Okay, 64. And so part of this scene, too, was dealing with this idea as I was doing research and realizing of the times there were just certain limitations placed on reality. Like people had a very different life circumstances. And one of those was realizing that women did not have what to expect when you're expecting in 1885, right? This is the book that I loved when I was pregnant with both my daughters because I could look and be like, oh, I'm at 22 weeks. This is what the fetus is developing. This is what's happening. Like I was fascinated by the science of it. And I had this realization with Sophie that she would not have an access to a book like that, and she certainly wouldn't have Google. She wouldn't have all online access to all this infinite information that we have now. And I got the sense in reading a lot of things that women were much kept in the dark about their own bodies and the pregnancies and different issues having to do with their own health. And I knew Sophie would not like that. She was a person who had been raised to be a thinker, an independent thinker, a reader, and intelligent. And I thought, oh, she's going to chafe at this idea that she can't find out what's happening with her own body and with this baby. So that's kind of where this scene develops from. And her friend at the barracks is Evelyn, who's a little bit of a troublemaker, but a good friend. So I'm going to start reading this little section here. Evelyn, and this is, again, Sophie's journal, so her story's told through journals as well. Evelyn asked if I had gone to tea with the other wives last week, if I had enjoyed it, and then went on without pause. Boring old biddies, aren't they? And they don't know what to think of you, Mrs. Forrester. Mrs. Connor says it's unseemly the way you wander about the woods by yourself. When I protested, she cut me off again, this time to praise me with backhanded compliments, calling me diverting, and going on for some time about my queer nature, staring at little birds for hours on end. Evelyn said, with field glasses and those clothes, you look positively the vagrant in that floppy hat. Where on earth do you traipse off to, even in the rain and wind? And now, to catch you sweeping before the help comes. But at least you aren't like the others, so dreadfully predictable. It is what they want from us, though, isn't it? A good woman is predictable and seeks out a predictable life. They would have us kept safe and quiet and insipid. This last bit was a pleasant surprise, a glint of an independent thinking spirit. I decided I could be candid. I told her of the surgeons refusing to lend me a book. So she'd asked the post surgeon to give her a book on gynecology and obstetrics so she could read about it. And I should say, Evelyn doesn't know that she's pregnant. Instantly, and for the first time that I can recall, I had Evelyn's complete attention. Not lend a book, that pompous old so-and-so. She would complain to her aunt and her uncle, the general, on my behalf. But no, they would likely side with the doctor. There is a bookshop in Portland, and they have very little on their shelves. But perhaps they might order it from San Francisco. Oh, but it could take weeks, months even. What is the topic of the book? Evelyn thought to ask, but then without a breath, but no, it doesn't matter, does it? Would he deny the same to a man? I should think not. And here, Evelyn stood up dramatically and raised a finger in the air. We should take it. Steal from the barracks hospital? Oh, steal. I only mean to borrow it for a few days. That old clod, he'll never notice one missing book. It's madness, clearly. I suspect Evelyn is not solely motivated by the injustice, but also entertained at the thought of goading me into mischief. However, I think she is right. No one would notice a book's absence right away, just an afternoon alone with it. February 13th. Evelyn Haywood, you are a devilish friend. Just now, a boy came to the house with a message. Miss Evelyn says you should know the post surgeon is seeing to the general at 2:00 and will likely be gone for some time. So if you were wanting to see Dr. Randall, you won't find him at the hospital then. And so it seems this afternoon is my chance. Oh, we could not stop laughing till my cheeks hurt. Evelyn ran into the house just as I was pulling the book out from beneath my coat, and I held it over my head like a prized trophy, and we began to laugh until we couldn't speak. It took me some time to tell her of my adventure. I had waited until a little after 2 and then walked the short distance to the hospital. Just as Evelyn said, his assistant informed me that the surgeon was out and not expected to return before the end of the day. Unless it was dire, he said, I should come back tomorrow. I said I was fine, but could I please sit in his office for a moment to rest? When the assistant left me to return to the main hospital room, I quickly studied the various titles on the shelf. On deafness and noises in the ear, disorders of digestion, treatise on gunshot wounds and other injuries of the chest. I was sure that on my earlier visits, I had seen at least 2 or 3 books on maternity, but then at last, a manual of obstetrics. I heard footsteps approaching the door, so sat down quickly with as much nonchalance as I could muster. The assistant passed by without looking. I quickly grabbed the book off the shelf and shoved it beneath my coat. It was only as I neared the outside hospital door that I thought to look again. A practical treatise on the most obvious diseases peculiar to horses. I had taken the wrong book. As I turned back into the hospital, I ran nearly headlong into the assistant. Are you unwell, Mrs. Forrester? He asked with genuine concern. He noticed the way I clutched my abdomen as I tried to hide the book beneath my coat. Oh, yes, just a bit tired. Might I sit down one last time? You don't need to trouble yourself. I can find my way back to Dr. Randall's office. In such a way, I was able to borrow the correct book and depart again without notice. Well, let me see what all the trouble is about, Evelyn said when I had finished my story, and she took the book. Oh, Sophie, are you? So I told her my news, and I begged her confidence. As I write this, however, I am anxious. I do hope I remember to rearrange the books on the shelf, or the empty space is sure to be noticed. February 15th, from a Manual of Obstetrics, Philadelphia, 1884. 3rd month, fetus grows to a length of 2.5, and by the end of the month, even 3.5 inches. Fingers and toes are formed, but are webbed. Head large compared with body, eyes prominent, lids joined together. Fingers and toes webbed like a waterfowl. How extraordinary. I'll stop there. Thank you all very much. So I would really love to open it up to questions now. I get a little self-conscious just standing up here talking, and I can't see you all very well. So I feel like I'm in a big black room all by myself talking. So if you guys would like to start coming up with some questions, I would love to hear what you all have to ask me. I think it'll make for a more interesting conversation if I can kind of engage with all of you. I think they're bringing some microphones out, and so you'll be able to just step up to the microphone and ask questions, and I really encourage you to do it. Don't be shy. I'm up here, so you can go up to the microphone too with me, I promise. Oh, good. Thank you. Yay, somebody's coming up.
I really enjoyed the book.
Oh.
So I listen to a lot of books, ebooks.
Yeah.
So does that, or audiobooks, does that change how you write now that audiobooks are so popular, or?
Yeah, this is a really interesting. So I love audiobooks too. I have about a half-hour drive from my house to like where my kids go to school and where we grocery shop, and so I listen to a ton of audiobooks. I think I've got like 3 going right now that I'm listening to. And War and Peace, that's how I got through War and Peace. I listened to the audiobook while I was cleaning, and then at night I would read. I'd find the page in the book and I would read, and I'd go back to the audiobook. So I love audiobooks. It's funny because when I was writing Bright Edge, I don't know that audiobooks. I feel like it's just been in the last year or 2, or maybe 4 years, there's a huge surge on them. And so I didn't think at all about that as I was writing. And I think there's a little bit of a problem with it in terms of the images and the map and the different things. Like you lose out on that part in terms of the of listening to the audio. And I'll confess too, I've never listened to the audio of either The Snow Child or The Bright Edge of the World. To be honest, and I have never reread them either. Once I'm done with it, I'm like, whew, I'm done with that, so it's gone. So I haven't listened to audio. I don't know what they're like. I hope they're good, but I do think I don't know if that'll affect me as I'm working on my next book. That's a really, I'll have to think about that. It's a really great question, because audiobooks are wonderful. Yeah, wonderful question. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Eowyn, thank you so much for coming to Bellingham.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
My question was about one of my favorite characters, not just in my book, but of any book I've ever written.
Oh.
Man Who Flies on Black Wings.
Oh, thank you.
Was that from Indian lore or something you came up with?
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great question. So yeah, I think the Raven shaman character came out from a lot of different things. I think here in the Pacific Northwest, as in Alaska, the Raven character is a huge character in Native mythology, and this idea of him being sort of a trickster and bringing both good and bad, and you're never sure exactly what you're going to bring. I found it really interesting to engage with that and to try to really understand it because it was so foreign to the ideas that I was raised with. And then at the same time, of course, the images I was more familiar with was sort of the Edgar Allan Poe Raven, the European, the harbinger of death and things. But specifically the idea of this man, as I was going through all these images, there was a photograph of a native man from Southeast Alaska from the I think it was early though, maybe 1870s, 1860s, and he had a black top hat on and had all these different things hanging on his neck, and he was an older man, and when I saw him, I just thought, oh, this is my guy. His image just really stayed with me. And I like the idea that he's there from the very beginning. You might not notice, but he's there at the very beginning up in the tree where the colonel sees him. And I like the idea that he's making things a little more interesting for the expedition along the way. Right? Yes. So I hope that kind of answers your question.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for the question. I really appreciate it. Yeah, over here.
Thank you. I just wanted to say I really, really loved your book.
Oh, thank you.
And one of the things I really liked about it is that you see it's through the perspective of the white man explorer, but you do bring in some of the perspectives of the indigenous population and what kind of Forrester is the harbinger of the white man coming and colonizing. And I thought about the character of Josh, the museum director, and that he kind of synthesizes both of those viewpoints. And so I was wondering what your inspiration was for the voice of Josh.
Yeah, thank you. I love this question. I love to have a chance to talk about this because for me this was a really kind of an important part in the process of writing the book. So I had read all these stories and I knew this was the way I wanted to tell To the Bright Edge of the World. But as I was working on it, I was increasingly uncomfortable with the idea of appropriation. I think this is a really important issue that readers and writers should all be thinking about and be aware of and be sensitive to. And so as I was working on it, I was just feeling like, this expedition was wonderful, it's amazing, but holy cow, the stuff that came to Alaska Natives after this is fairly significant. Some of it good, and a lot of it not so good. And how does a young Native person feel about this today? And so as I was first writing it, Walt's voice came to me very quickly. Right from the beginning, I knew Walt's character inside and out. I knew who he was going to be. But Josh, at one point early on, was just a placeholder. Sometimes if I can't think of a character, it's kind of this weird version of myself, right? It's just some, middle-aged woman running the museum. But what happened is I reached out to a friend of mine, Arjun Karvanaskov, who is a wonderful artist. He's a part of the Ninilchik tribe up in Alaska. And he and I had gotten to know each other a little bit through the library world, actually. And so I was so nervous to call him. I don't know why. I just felt like I was imposing and asking too much. But at the same time, I felt like I needed to have this conversation. So I called him and I said, hey, this is the new book that I'm working on. Here's what I'm doing. And I want to ask you some really invasive questions. Will you do this for me? How do you feel about being Alaska Native? How do you feel about the history and these stories that I'm telling and what that expedition meant, the real expedition, what it brought, and what all the expeditions and missionaries brought to Alaska? And so I will tell you, all of a sudden, Josh came into view for me. And he is... he's probably the only character I've ever written that is almost directly from reality. Usually my characters are completely fictionalized. Josh, in many ways, is Arjun. And anything intelligent that Josh says about issues for Indigenous people in Alaska came straight from Arjun's mouth. I quoted him very directly. And I have to say, it's been really fun. After it happened, he actually wrote to me. So one of the main differences, probably the only difference, is that Arjun didn't have anything to do with a museum. He was an artist. He was involved with the Ninilchik Library. After the book came out, actually not that long ago, he emailed me. He's like, hey, I have a funny story for you. I just got appointed the director of the museum here in Ninilchik. And I just love that. I was like, okay, you never know what's going to happen, right? And he's working on a piece called Natagi that is inspired by my Natagi character. So I guess that, to me, that relationship with Arjun and how Josh came to be is so important to me. And I'm just, thank you for that question. I really appreciate it. And that's how Josh came to be. So, Yeah, do you have a question of me? Yeah, please.
Yes. Thank you. There we go. I really enjoyed your book. I read it while I was in Kenai, Alaska, visiting my son. So
fantastic.
I was like, I was really cold.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, Ninilchik is right near Kenai, actually.
Right, exactly. My point exactly.
Yep.
So my question is about the indigenous people and the museum director, kind of, sort of. So in many of the scenes, the indigenous people are described as poor, hungry, starving, people.
Yeah.
And I was wondering why you didn't describe the flu, measles, smallpox pandemics that decimated the population between the 1830s and well into 1919 with the Spanish flu. And that was a big reason why those people were in those situations. And it was never directly, gave the impression that those are poor people there.
Okay.
And they weren't, and they aren't. And so I was wondering why that gap.
Yeah, this is a great question. So I think the distinction comes between, say, Southeast Alaska or even Yukon versus the Copper River. So the Yukon area, so when I say Yukon, I mean the Yukon River drainage.
I know where the Yukon River is.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm trying to just discriminate between that and the Yukon Territory. So the Yukon River drainage, Southeast Alaska, they had a lot of influence from missionaries, Russians, all this very early on, as far as the 1830s. The Copper River is a very different landscape and a different situation. Okay. So there were no white people ever made it up the Copper River until Henry Allen went in 1885. Okay. So that was kind of what was remarkable about his expedition.
Okay, I didn't know that.
The Russians had been trying so hard to make it up there and having really terrible interactions, partly of their own doing, with the native people there. And so they kept getting pushed back both by the river and the people. So when Henry Allen did that expedition in 1885, it was the very first white people to go up. Now, once they get over and across the mountains and they're on the Yukon River, you're absolutely right. The other thing that's different about the Copper River is that it's what you call starving country. So there's a rush of salmon that come in the fall, late summer, early fall, where there's a tremendous abundance. And then from there on out, it is very, very hungry country. So it's not like, even if you're like in, say, Kodiak or South Central Alaska, there's quite a bit of game. There's caribou, there's moose, there's different things, and certainly deer like in Southeast Alaska. So when you look at the native populations in Southeast Alaska, they had a tremendous amount of abundance, in terms of game until white people came and changed everything. So I think, and that's why when Henry Allen's traveling up in the real expedition, they are starving. And it's because that's the land that they're dealt. So yeah, but I think this is a really interesting question. I think partly what it brings up, I think Alaska is so huge, So Southeast Alaska is so different than interior Alaska versus they're completely different landscapes and in ways different histories until a certain point and they start to converge a little bit more.
Thank you. I didn't realize that about the Copper River
Yeah,
Basin.
no, thank you. It's a really great
Because I'm very familiar with Southeast and very familiar with the Kenai Peninsula, two different places.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, this question is from my book club.
Oh, wonderful.
And we noticed there was a different cover on the hardback and the paperback.
Yeah, this is
and we were wondering what the significance of the picture on this paperback was. Is that you?
Oh, I love that. It's so funny. I have never heard that before, but someone at Ferndale asked the same thing. This is so fun. I love it. So it's interesting, and I know I'm being recorded, so I feel like I should be careful about what I say about publishers, because I love my publisher. I do. I do. But it is an interesting thing with covers. So by contract, I get to express an opinion about the covers, right? So, I get to say, I hate that cover. Or my agent says, well, don't be so strong about it. Tame it down a little bit. But I actually do like all my covers. I am very fortunate that way. So this is the paperbacks. I don't know if anybody out here has the hardcover. It's a very different cover. Oh, there is someone that has the hardcover right there. Probably nobody can see it. But it's a picture of a bird. It's a raven that you can kind of see the mountains in the background. Thank you very much for holding that up. I'll tell you, the very first cover they came out with, I'll backtrack one more time. Snow Child cover I love. It's by an artist named Alessandro Gottardo. And to me, it's a little postmodern and different. I was surprised when I saw it, and then it really grew on me, and I really loved it. So when The Bright Edge came around, I said, hey, is there any way we can use that artist? It would be fun to use the same artist. And they were like, no, we're going to go a different direction. So they came back to me with a cover that was to me, sort of there was this whole trend. Those of you who are librarians and booksellers, you'll know there's a trend of having women's heads on the cover of books, the outline of women's heads, and I don't know, it was just this thing for a while. So they sent me this cover that was a woman's head, and I think it was supposed to be Sophie, but her hairstyle was all wrong for 1885. I know they didn't know that, but I was like, what? what? And it was this idea you could see the mountains and the raven through her head. And I'm like, well, she didn't even get to see the mountains and the raven. Like, I guess she did see the raven, but it was like she didn't go to Alaska. So I wrote and I said, I hate it. Like, and I'm never going to get a guy to pick up this book at the bookstore either. Like, come on. So then they came out with the one that's the raven kind of image where you can see the mountains. And I liked it fairly well. But then it was interesting when the paperback came out, for some reason they wanted to do a different cover. I don't know how they decide this. The Snow Child had basically the same cover for both. But they went and got Alessandro Gottardo. So the artist, the Italian artist that had done the Snow Child, did this, the paperback cover as well. And we had some little bits of back and forth, and ultimately I was like, okay, I like it. And then someone at Ferndale said, so who is this woman? Like, that's not Sophie, and it's not Natalia. Who is that? And I said, I have no idea who it is. But at this point, I wasn't going to fight any more battles, right? I kept pushing, and I was like, yeah, it's great, I love it. So it's not me, and it's not Sophie. I don't know who it is, but we're going with it, right? But that's a great question. Thank you for that. Yeah, over here.
Well, I do like that cover. I think it's intriguing because I want to know who that person is. Maybe it's
you may never find out.
Returning to the question of the indigenous people, I was wondering what sort of response, if any, have you gotten from Native Alaskans? And how do they feel about reading their folklore and their legends and their history in this way?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, partly why I reached out to Arjun is as a part of a Native community that was a part of kind of the area in general that I was talking about. I wanted to sort of get his perspective and make sure that like he was comfortable. I don't know, you just feel like you want to kind of feel things out a little bit. And as I said, really his perspective changed a lot of what I wrote about Josh. Beyond that, I mean, it's funny because I think it's the same as with white readers. Like, I get some good feedback and I get some bad feedback. I would say I have only had one, and the only reason I know this, God, I hate to confess this, so I read my Amazon reviews and my Goodreads reviews. Isn't that horrible? I honestly, I feel like it's some kind of compulsion that I need to stop, but I can't seem to stop. So I've had Native people write to me, invite me out to the villages to do book events out there. I feel like mostly Native people have been very receptive and excited about my books, which means a lot to me. There was one person, see, this is sick that I know this. There was somebody on Goodreads who was a part of a tribe, I think in the Eagle River area, who actually what she didn't like about it, which I found really fascinating, is she didn't like that I had fictionalized the tribe. So she was okay that I had, told some of the stories and had the white people walk into the stories, but she didn't want it to be a fictionalized Wolverine River tribe, which I found that really interesting, and I was trying to take that in and think about it. But at the same time, I fictionalized everything about the book. I fictionalized Forster, I fictionalized Sophie, because I wanted the freedom to tell my own story. So I think that's the only real criticism I think I've gotten from it. But it is something I worried about a lot as I was writing it. It's an important, as I say, I feel like as writers, we need to be open to those conversations and try to learn as much as we can to do it correctly, but to somehow not be afraid of including diverse people in our books. And it's a tricky, I don't want to just write about middle-aged white women with 2 daughters. I want to write about other people that I've met and I know. So I feel like it's a tricky balance, and I hope that answers the question. I don't know if it is. Yeah, over here.
So this isn't really a question, but I would love to hear you talk about the baby and how, the baby was birthed out of the tree, and just kind of what that was all about.
Yeah, the spruce root baby. Yeah, I was telling the Ferndale Library that was one of my very, very favorite scenes to write. Like, I saved it. Somebody asked me if I write sort of from beginning to end, and I do try to do that. I try to start at the beginning and weave my way forward, and that was like an incentive for me. I kept wanting to write that scene, and I was like, no, I got to do the hard work of getting to where that scene happens. So that was a story that I came across. I think it was in an oral history, so there were a bunch of stories that had been collected through oral histories, and it was just a story. I mean, pretty much the story, a very basic outline of a baby having been born from a spruce root. And I think it was just one of those moments, it's happened to me a lot, where it's like you realize you're so centered in your own cultural history and what you know of the world. Some of the stories I came across, and I was like, what? Like a baby born out of a spruce root. Like, it was just so mind-boggling to me and fascinating. And then to suddenly think of Alan Forrester actually having to deliver this baby and pull it out. I mean, it was just like, once I struck up, my imagination just hooked on it, and I just found it fascinating. Now, the story that I read, it goes on to lots of other strangeness. I mean, where the baby ends up growing up and saving a village, I think, from some sort of zombie-like creatures. I mean, it gets really wild. And so I did weave that in a little bit, you know, in the character who ends up being a very important leader in the Native community. So I tried to kind of toy with the story and ground it in some kind of reality, which I find really fun, to take something that's really fantastical and say, okay, but what if this really happened? What would that be like? So that was kind of how that came about. Yeah, over here.
I have a question about what your advice is for parents of young writers and also young writers themselves. I've got a 12-year-old who loves to write creatively, and I just want to know how I can further his interest in that.
Yeah, oh, I'd love to hear that. Yeah, you know, it's funny, both my daughters swear they never want to be novelists, and yet they're both each have written novels, like they're writing secretly. And it's funny because I think the advice depends on your child. Like, my oldest daughter wanted to share it all with me. You know, she's 21 now, but at the time when she was, I don't know, even between 8 and 15, she was always working on something, and she wanted to read every passage to me, you know, and I would just be encouraging, you know, and just say, yeah, keep going, this is fun, keep doing this. And with my younger daughter, it's a big secret. She won't let me anywhere near it. I don't know what's in that novel that she's writing, but I'm not allowed to read it, and I try to respect that privacy. You know, I tell her, like, hey, if you want to share it with me sometime. And the advice, too, is that, you know, my mom and I had a wonderful writing friendship. She and I were writing partners, and one of the rules that we made for ourselves when I was writing The Snow Child is we would trade a chapter. I'd give her a chapter, and she'd give me a poem. She was a poet, and we could only say good things about it. We wouldn't you know, we'd say, hey, this is great, keep doing that. We wouldn't say, oh, what are you doing here? This is terrible, right? Because that's going to come later. You're going to have an editor or a teacher who rips it apart. So I guess I feel like that maybe is to just be like, yeah, this is cool, keep doing this. And maybe also saying, you know, editors have done this for me, and I'm always so hugely happy. They say, you know what? So-and-so wrote a book that has some interesting things like that. Hey, maybe read, you know, whatever, because I feel like reading is such an integral part of the writing process. So, and that's advice for adults, too. I was thinking about what I'll say. I'm going to visit Western tomorrow, and I'm a little nervous because I don't do craft talks. Like, that's not usually my thing. But I was thinking about advice that I would give. It's like, read everything. Read everything you think you're going to hate and you think you're going to love. Read different forms, poetry, whatever, and then just write as long as it's fun. You know, if it stops being fun, don't do it anymore. That's what I say. Yeah, over here.
Thanks. I wanted to thank you so much for the piece that you submitted to the Whatcom Writes Anthology.
Oh, thank you.
It was beautiful, and several of us were talking about shedding a tear here and there. And maybe it's a great segue. Could you speak a little more about your writing family? And I loved your mother's poem, and I can't wait to read more of them. But it sounds like you come by your craft honestly.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I owe a lot to my mom. She actually just passed away almost a year ago, which was a very, very hard loss. And I have to say, I don't usually do plugs for either for myself or for anyone else, but I just found out Village Books has my mom's book of poetry. They're selling it there. So thank you so much to Paul and everyone at Village Books for doing that. Not a lot of, you know what? Absolutely. And not just because it's my mom's book of poetry. I'll tell you, lots of bookstores are not good about carrying poetry at all, which makes me very sad. So I'm glad that Village Books is a poetry, they promote poetry. Yeah, so my mom, you know, growing up, we were just a huge reading family. One of my favorite memories, some of my favorite memories are every year the library in Palmer would have a book sale. I don't know if they do that here too, where they, you know, books that are going to get discarded or whatever. And it was this huge thing. Me and my mom and my dad would kind of sigh like, oh God, you're going to get more books, right? And we would just fill up these boxes and boxes of books because they were like 50 cents and $1, you know. And so growing up, our home was filled full of books and of people reading. Like, that's what we did. And my dad was a builder, but he had actually gotten his degree in English literature. So we were just always talking about books, reading books, all different. Like, there was no there was no classist elitism in terms of what we read, right? I mean, my dad loved Louis L'Amour's, but then he would also read Wallace Stegner. I mean, we just read everything. My mom would joke that if she didn't have a good book, she would just read the cereal box while she was eating breakfast. And my husband was like, "You guys are crazy!" Like he would come over. We dated all through high school before we got married, and he would come in and we would be watching television and reading books, or we'd be eating dinner and someone would have a book out, and he'd be like, "God, it's like a library in here or something," you know. So it was just very much a part. And then what happened is, around the time that I decided I really wanted to start writing fiction more, my mom was also like, she had been kind of writing poetry when she had time, but she really wanted to put more of her time and heart into writing poetry. She ended up getting her master's in fine arts from Antioch University in LA and writing poetry. She did that after she had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer. So she got her MFA, she published her first book of poetry just all shortly before she died. So she was an inspiration to me all through. And I could tell you so many stories where she's the one who made me meet my agent, because I was at Kachemak Bay Writers Conference and I had written The Snow Child. I was maybe 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through it, and I saw this famous agent was at Kachemak, and my mom said, "You should go talk to him about your book." And I said, "No, Mom, I'm not going to go talk to him about my book." And she said, "No, go. So finally she harassed me into signing up to talk to this guy, and then he offered to represent my book and sold it. So my mom gets lots of shout outs. I miss her very, very much. And this is her scarf, actually, that I'm wearing tonight. So yeah, thank you very much for that question. I really appreciate a chance to talk about her. Yeah, over here.
Good evening. Before I came, I Googled you because I wanted to see if you'd written any other books. And I saw something, Last Days at Hunting Camp, but it's not. And I asked them out there, it's not published. Can you talk about other books you have written and something kid, Kids and...
Last Days in Hunting Camp, is that the one you...
Yes, that's the one but I saw recently another one.
Okay, so I think I can answer. Yep, this is a great question. Thank you. Last Days in Hunting Camp was actually just a little short story that I had written that my UK publisher wanted to sell as an ebook. So it's only available in the UK, and it's only a short story. And I'll have to say, short stories are not my forte, so I don't think you're missing out on anything. I mean, it's okay, but I'm not really excited about it. The other one you might have seen is Shadows on the Wolverine. I don't know if that's the one you saw a title of. That was the original title of To the Bright Edge of the World. So I had, proposed the book and said Shadows on the Wolverine. I was super excited about this title. And I wrote the book, and I wove some things in that, referenced this title. And at the time of the proposal, my editor didn't say anything about the title, so I was like, okay, we're going with this. In the case of The Snow Child, I had come up with a lot of other possible titles because I didn't know if they would like that one. But with Shadows on the Wolverine, I felt like I'd gotten the thumbs up. So I turned the manuscript in, and she has I could go into that too. I had to do a major edit that was very, very painful. But in addition, she said, I kind of hate the title too. Can you come up with a new title? And I was like, what? I'd woven it in so artfully, I thought. And so I spent, oh my gosh, a miserable probably 2 weeks just looking at words in the dictionary, looking at titles, throwing different words out. And so I think I sent 6 possible titles to my agent, her, and my UK editor. And they all agreed on To Bright Edge of the World. And I was like, phew. Now, the only problem with that title, I think it's kind of a mouthful. And people are like, isn't it like something about the edge of the world? So I don't know if that's what you saw with Shadows on the Wolverine. So I only have the 2 books, The Snow Child, To the Bright Edge of the World. And I am working on a new one, fingers crossed. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks for coming tonight. I was going to ask you about what you're working on next.
Oh, perfect time. I did not set that up.
Well, that was my plan, but it sounded like maybe if you didn't want to talk about that.
No, I'm happy to.
Please tell us what you're working on
Yeah,
next.
perfect. It's like we couldn't have planned that better. Thank you. Yeah, so it's kind of nice timing because this is the first time I've ever talked publicly about my new book idea. Because when it's early on, I feel like, I've had 1,000 ideas for books, right? And I've gotten so far in some of them and sent them to my agent, and he's been like, yeah, not so excited about it, or I lose interest, or whatever happens. So I'm always very, very hesitant to talk about anything until I get to a certain point where I'm like, okay, I think there's a good chance this might happen. So I just recently got to that point with my new idea, so I can tell you a little bit about it. So it's tentatively called, but as I said, right, this title could change. So don't be looking for this title. Who knows what I might have to change it to. It's called The Bear Hunter right now. And you'll see some, I think people will see some similarities with my other work so far. It's set in Alaska. I'm partway into writing it and working with my agent on it and potentially an editor. And the idea of it is it's set in 1980s and 1990s Alaska, so a little more recent, really during my childhood in Alaska is the time frame for it. And the idea is that a young woman about 25, falls in love with a man and decides to move with her daughter, her 5-year-old daughter, and this man that she kind of knows but not super well, out on the other side of the Wolverine River. So the Wolverine River's there, Alpine is there, there's a lodge that she works at. She meets this man. They move to the other side of the river where he has a cabin and he's lived most of the time. Well, when she gets there, she realizes he's actually a grizzly bear. And so that's not going to end well, right? That's not going to end well. And so you kind of know from the very beginning that she gets killed by the bear. But the 5-year-old girl survives. So it's partly a survival escape story, but interwoven with it is the idea that Emmeline, the little girl, and her name could change. I don't know what the editor is going to do to me, right? But right now her name's Emmeline. When she gets to be about 16, she runs away back to Alaska. She's living in a suburb of Seattle with her aunt, and she runs away to Alaska because she wants to find out what really happened to her mom. So she's sort of tracking the mystery of what happened to her mom as you're also following her and her mom trying to escape from the bear. And I've gotten to do, I have to tell you, one of the great perks about being a novelist, like this is my job now, I've gotten to do some amazing research. I actually went out with a good friend of ours who lives across the road from us. He's a big game guide. He guides brown bear hunters in Kodiak. I spent 2 weeks with him and his hunter in a very remote camp in a little 3-man tent for 2 weeks watching bears. It was incredible. It was intense. So I've gotten to do some really fun research for it, and I think my agent and editor are excited, so we'll see where it goes. Yeah, so thank you very much for asking that. Thank you. Yeah, over here.
So this...
Oh, it's a little taller.
I hope I'm going to word this properly. It kind of came out of a discussion at book club, and we were talking about some of the loss of the baby, and then the birth of the baby in the tree, and Pruitt's losing his ability to do photography and his ability to express, and then Sophie's gaining that ability.
I love that.
So part of the ooh-ah was that if you think of so many indigenous stories are about harmony and balance.
Oh,
and so there was a question that sort of emerged. Was this something that you did intentionally, or was it something that
I planned it all along?
Yeah. No, was it kind of birthed through doing the story?
Yeah, so this is one of my very, very favorite things about talking with really engaged readers. And we would have these moments in my book club where we would just you start thinking about things and questioning, and you start to get to this idea that feels, and what I love about it as a writer is that sometimes people see things that I did not consciously realize. Now, I will say, as far as the baby, I did toy with that. Like, I like the idea that we don't know, like, there's a scientific reason, and I'm sorry if we're giving anything away if someone hasn't finished the book, but I'm just going to go for it. So there's scientific reasons why Sophie loses the baby, right? And there's a valid reason why there's a raven pecking on the outside of her window. And so maybe that's just the explanation, right? But maybe... does the raven cause the miscarriage? Or is he just there because he knows the miscarriage is going to happen and he's carrying the spirit back? Or is there no connection? Is this just random coincidence like happens in life? I guess I liked the idea that I don't know the answer to that. I mean, that's just the truth. I don't know but I liked laying out those possibilities and leaving that a little open to readers. Now, the other thing about Pruitt losing his ability to photograph, and I just that did not occur to me at all, and I love it. And I think that was, I'd love to take credit for it. It was my subconscious working on a deeper level, right? I don't know. But I love that. This is what I find so fascinating about reading and writing and this is something I was going to talk about when I go to Western tomorrow, is it's a conversation, right? In some strange way, it's a conversation between the reader and the writer that builds on it. So the reader brings their own background and their knowledge, and then they talk with other readers in these kinds of situations where you all get together and talk about books, and you find new meanings or deeper meanings, and it's what I love. I just really love that. So thank you very, very much. Say hi to your book club for me. Tell them well done. Yeah, over here.
Hi. First of all, thanks for coming.
Oh, thank you.
And I loved your book enough that I read it twice through the Village Books, which was selected for our book group. And I enjoyed all your characters, but especially Sophie, because I enjoy photographing birds, and I can't imagine how she did it during that time. But the one question I had was that, if I understood correctly, it seemed like her father was like mentally ill, and her mom was somewhat righteous. And she seemed like a very strong woman. I just didn't understand how she overcame, this family that was very dysfunctional.
Right. Well, I'm not sure how personal to get here. Like, I think that a lot of people I think I'm inspired by people that come from very dysfunctional but interesting families and somehow come out on the other end of it okay. And I think it happens a lot, maybe more than we realize, right? That, and I think that, and the truth that there's some inspiration from my own family just in terms of people who are creative and have different levels of functioning in the world, and so I think that was partly what I was looking at is how families influence in all different kinds of ways. And it's just interesting too with Sophie. I feel like I kind of backtracked. Like I came up with her character, and then I thought, okay, how could she get to be who she is? And I guess I felt like that was the right combination of background. So I think that her father gave her a tremendous curiosity and passion and sense of art, whatever that might be. And then her mom was very intelligent and tough, right? And so I think that could bring about Sophie. But it's a great question. It really is. And it is a funny aspect of writing characters because you're sort of psychoanalyzing the people you know and yourself and character traits in general and trying to make someone who you think hopefully is believable to readers. So yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Thank you. Yeah, over here.
You mentioned that the editing process was really grueling and difficult. Are there any plot twists or sideline stories or scenes that you had to cut that you really wish you didn't have to, that we might get as a bonus story in Bellingham?
Oh, this is a great question. So I will tell you one thing. I decided early on with both The Snow Child and this book that I don't like to share the what ifs, like the other potential. The only reason I do that is because I feel like it's sort of a dream trance-like state, this magical bubble that you hope to create with a book. And if I tell you what might have happened, I feel like it shatters that illusion a little bit. I don't know how to explain it, but I have this hesitance to say everything that I almost did or I wrote and then scrapped because I feel like it's going to ruin the illusion to some extent. But I will tell you, it was hellacious, that edit. I mean, it was, and one thing I can say is that some of it was just structural. I think I talked about this a little bit in Ferndale, but originally Sophie's part of the story was all told through letters to Alan that she gives to him and he reads along the way. And when I first did this, and again, I told the Ferndale Library about this, my agent was like, yeah, this is not working at all. Like, she needs to have her own journal in real time. And I was like, it is working. I love this. Like, this is my vision from the beginning. And I made so many changes he wanted, and I was like, I'm not changing this. Like, I believe in this. So I turned it into my editors. It's my UK editor and my US editor. They work together. And they come back, and in addition to saying we don't like the title, they say, yeah, this isn't working with her letters. And I was like, oh, damn. He was right. He's always right. My agent's always right. And so what happened is, these parts are all integrated. Like, I wrote it together, all of it, so that there's a little, hopefully, some resonance between Alan's journals, the postcard or whatever, and then Sophie's letter at the time. I had written it all so it was like this, I hoped, and I had to rip it out. So the book is about 110,000 words, and I had to rip out 30,000 words of Sophie's story and set it aside. And I'll tell you, this is another fond memory of my mom. So I called her and I was like, blah, 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 blah. You're not going to believe what they want me to do. And she said, okay, but what if you do the work, just do the hard work of rewriting it and take 6 months to do, and that's about what it took me, 6 months to rewrite it. And then ultimately, if you feel like your original manuscript is better, then just stand your ground and say, you know what, I did what you wanted me to, and it's no good, and I want my original book. And maybe it'll come out okay, like just do it. And I was like, yeah, you're right. It's always come down to just do more work, right? And so I did it, and then I was like, oh, shoot, they're right, it's better. And that's one really hard thing about being edited is like my ego gets in the way sometimes, and my laziness. Like, I don't want to rewrite this whole thing over again. Like, this is hard. And so I feel like I have to give a lot of credit to my editors and my agent. As much as I dread turning things into them and getting feedback and knowing that not everything's going to be perfect the first time around, I really feel like they've pushed me to write better. And they never give me the answer. They never say like, hey, you need to have Sophie do X, or this needs to it's just like, hey, this part is not working for us, and we need something better. And it's like, okay, you're not going to give me the answer, are you? So I just have to do the hard work. But yeah, thank you very much for that question. I appreciate that. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. You weren't supposed to see me. I was sneaking up on you. Yes, no, that's good. So it turns out we have time for one more question.
Oh, perfect.
And I get to ask it.
Okay.
Since I'm up here and I have a microphone. So Eowyn, what is next year's Whatcom Reads book?
Don't you love that? I love this. And I have to say, I am so honored to get to make this announcement. And when I found out what it was, I think I gave a little squeal of delight, because I have read this book. And not only have I read it, we have a lot of readers in our little neighborhood. And I have like tons and tons of books. I'm like a little walking library myself. And so people will come over and get books from me. And so I took this book and I said, you have to read this. My dad read it. All my favorite readers read this book, and everyone liked it. So I'm going to read the official announcement now, and I'm really excited that you guys get to have this pleasure. So next year's title begins a world away from To the Bright Edge of the World on a sugar plantation on Barbados, where a British gentleman scientist named Titch Wilde befriends George Washington Black, a 12-year-old slave. Titch is a man of big ideas and dreams, intent on perfecting a giant hot air balloon he calls a cloud cutter. He convinces his cruel and sadistic brother to loan him the boy to assist him. Titch soon discovers that Wash is a talented artist with a quick mind, and the two form a bond that will bring them to the farthest corners of the world. I am so pleased to announce that the 2021 Whatcom Reads title will be Washington Black by S.E. Ejidan. Yeah, you guys are in for a treat.
So I also love the book. This is another spoiler alert. I've read it. So you have 12 months to read and discuss this book that you can find at your library or at Village Books. And we hope to see you at the Whatcom Reads event next year. Meanwhile, one more big round of applause for Eowyn Ivey.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you guys for coming. Thank you.